we're gonna go into some deformers now, because right now we have eye controls. We can move this guy around, but he's pretty rigid and there's not much he can do. He can just go up, down, and he can rotate, right? So what we want to do is we want to be able to have him do a couple of other things. We want him to be able to rotate this one right here, right? Maybe we want to be able to bend these guys a little bit. Okay. And we want to be able to have him twist and squash and stretch. Alright. So let's see what we can do here. Let's begin with making this part right here deform a bit. So we can go to nonlinear deformers, and we're going to, for this character, we're going to use bend, we're going to use squash, and we're going to use twist. Those are what we're going to use. Now I'm going to show you just on a polygon cube what each one of these does. Okay. Now, in order for these deformers to work, you kind of need enough geometry, enough spans of geometries broken down for it to deform properly. And I'll just give you an example. So I have twist right here, and I just put it on, and I can say start angle is like this, end angle is like this, and you see that twists very nicely, right? But after a while it starts to break down. Now if I delete this, but I have subdivisions on here, and I do the same thing, twist, you can see it can twist a lot more. So when you're creating your nonlinear deformers, or really any deformer, joints, your character has to have this geometry, or else it's not going to be able to work. Alright? So this is the twist, but let's look at some others. Twist handle, I'm just going to delete that. And let's look at squash. So squash has a factor. So this is stretching, this is squashing. And you see it. What's good about this nonlinear deformer is it's better than scaling because it maintains volume. So this, like, if you're talking about principles of animation, this squash uses a mathematical calculation to maintain that volume. So it's quite good, especially for a simple character like this. Alright, and then we're going to try bend, and you have to go here, curvature, and bend will curve up and down. Now, let's look at this a little bit. Let's do curvature. Just pull it over here. Okay, it's outside of that, so it's kind of broken. But what you'll see is I have this line in the middle. And then I have a line that goes up, and I have a line that goes down. What that is that's the center point. My low bound is anything from the middle down. So if I say my low down is 0, that means that there's nothing connected. So if I want to have this twisting from the base rather than from the middle, because that's the base is kind of where the feet are, where the weight is, then I'm going to have to get rid of my low bound, and I'm going to have to double my high bound. So now, instead of twisting from the middle, I'm twisting from the base. Alright? So low bound and high bound are very important. The same thing goes for squash. right now it squashes right here. But that's quite difficult. If he's going to pull down and then jump up, I'm going to have to animate it down and up. But if I have it squashing from the base, and I'll show you how that looks, then I need to get rid of my low bound, 0, put my high bound to 2, and you can see this. I'll move it down so that my low down is right here. And now, my factor, so it squishes from the bottom here. So if I wanted to go squish down and then jump up, boom, I can squish that from the base right there. So it's very important to remember that we need to keep low bound and high bound in consideration. All right? And twist will also have the same thing. Right now, I can say start angle is up there, end angle is up there. So twist, I don't need to worry about it because it already has from the bottom and from the top. So I can just leave that. All right? So let's look at how this might influence things. But before we do that, we need to talk about order of operations. All right? So those nonlinear deformers are going to affect everything that's in their group. But you need to add them last. Let's go back to order of operations. All right? Where is it? Okay. A lot of times we model and then we add in certain shading, UVs, blend shapes, joints, different things, controls. In this case, the order of operations are you need to get the eyes done first, you need to get maybe the control for the face done, and then you need to get some controls for the feathers or whatever, the tail kind of thing on the top of his head done. And then we can squash and stretch everything. So we're going to start with the feathers right here. And I want these to just bend. So I'm going to click bend. All right. And if I click here, curvature, they're going to bend one in the wrong direction. I need to bend them forward and backward. Like this. And they shouldn't be bending from the middle, they need to be bending from the base. So again, high bound or low bound should be 0. High bound should be 1. And I need this to be local. Object. Move this down. High bound should be 2, sorry. And now I can move these up and down. So when he's jumping around, these can have some nice little wiggle. Alright, so that's good. But where do we put this? This is bend handle right here. Look what happens if I don't parent. Let's go back to this right here. Hierarchy. If I don't have my hierarchy correct, then I'm going to run into problems. So if I move my local control, what happens? That gets broken. So I need to, there's my big feathers, I need to parent my bend there. So now it follows. So you see here, big feather, small feather, and bend handle. Now the other thing is, I want to be able to, let's just pull this back. I want to be able to animate this feather with a control. Alright? And so what I might want to do is create a new controller right here. Here's my control windows. Alright? And I can create, let's do the radioactive symbol. Alright. And I have my radioactive symbol right here. And what I want to do is I want to be able to maybe just put this radioactive symbol somewhere around here. Scale it up a bit. And I want to be able to animate it like this and like this so that it controls these guys right here. Alright? Now the problem is one of my all controls should have default attributes. Translate X, Y, Z, rotate X, Y, Z, and X, Y, Z scale should be 1 and these should all be 0. But if I try to zero these out, they go where I don't want it to be. The other problem is I need to think about my pivot point. The pivot point of this should be down here so that it pivots from right at the base of these feathers. Alright? Now how do I do that so that I can have these default 0 and these default 1? One option is you can say, oh, I can freeze my transformations. But when you do that, your local rotation changes. You see how this thing right here has an angle like this, but my Y is like this. Alright? So normally when we're trying to do controls, we want our rotations to fit the actual, see here, this is the local rotation of the object. So this is incorrect. Now if I move it like this, so that my Y rotation is in the right plane of rotation, well, it moves this thing. Also, it starts to put values here. So what do? I say freeze transformations, but it puts the Y rotation back. So this is not what I want. So I'm going to do something instead. And this is where naming conventions and grouping are important. This is where we're going to use the connect group or constraint group right here. So I'm going to create radioactive again, and I'm just going to keep it right here. I'm going to keep it right here at the bottom. And I'm going to call this feather CTL, feather control, and I'm going to group it. I'm going to call it feather CTL CNT. CNT is connect. Now, if you remember from before, I can have lots of garbage values in my CNT because I'm not going to animate this. I'm animating the control. So now what I can do is I can use my feather control CNT to move this up and get it in the right place. Alright? And remember, I'm using the CNT group, I'm not using the control. So I'm going to rotate it. I can even scale it a bit. Put it right where I want it to be. Okay, something like that. So it's got all of these dirty values here, but my control, which is what I'm actually going to animate, is exactly where I want it to be. I want it to have the default zeros and the default ones. Alright. So now what do? I have my big feather here. Now I can do this in a couple of different ways. I can bring this, put it under body. Alright. Again, my local controls are still clean. And I can take my big feather geo right here and I can put it underneath there. So now I can rotate that object. Alright? But what about the bend handle right here? What about the bend handle? The bend handle needs to have another connection. So I have my feather control right here. I need to add an attribute. And I'm going to call this feather bend. Alright? Feather bend. And that's down below. And I'm going to use a new, I'm not going to use set driven keys. I'm going to use, let's go back here. I'm going to use connection editor, which is computationally less expensive than set driven keys or constraints. So I'm going to open up the connection editor, and that's here, and you'll see that connection, so that's on the left, and that's the feather bend. And then I need to grab my bend handle, reload that here, and you'll see it has curvature. So feather bend connects to curvature, and this is going to have a yellow highlight. That means it's connected. So I can go here, grab my feather bend, and I can do that. What that does is it means I can take this right here and I can turn this off. And I don't even see it. I just grab this, feather bend, and then I can rotate it however I want. Okay? So let's create another control for the mask now. And this control is going to control a couple of different things. And let's try inner square. And what I'm going to do is I'm going to call this head CTL, and I'll just group it, and I'll call it head CTL and then CNT. Alright, now I'm going to move it up here like so, 90. Something like a little bit high. Alright, and again this has got zeros all along and ones, and this one has all of my garbage in it. Alright, and I'm just going to parent this to the body. One thing you can see, it's kind of interesting, is this body has some geometry on there, and you see this is 11, 3, 1, 90. When I parent it, actually it starts, the local space actually changes based on the fact that it just got parented to something that already has a local space with some adjusted attributes, some adjusted channels. So that's another reason why we put it in the CNT, because this one stays zeroed out. So now I'm going to connect the head control to the mask. And I'm going to use the constraints to do that. Alright, so I select the driver and the driven, and I'm going to select two things. First is orient constraint. Orient is the rotations. So you can see here, as I rotate it, it rotates according to the pivot point of each one. This one has its own pivot point, and this one has its own. This one has a highlight of blue. That means it's not keyable. Now, if I animate up and down or I scale, it doesn't connect. So if I wanted this to be able to jiggle a little bit, I might want to be able to animate the translate also. So let's go to point constraint, contain offset, and now this goes up, goes this way, and it also goes this, so I can have it fly off, and this allows me to, if I wanted to, I can animate it so it kind of goes askew a little bit, go up a little bit, so something like this. So you can do that, and it still has the rotation right there. And then, because, and this is a good example of why we want to have this default. So I've just tested it. But what if I wanted to get it back at the original position? I just go here and I zero it out. So this is why when we're rigging, we try to make sure that the default translate and rotates are 0, and default scales, XYZ scales are 1. Alright, we're getting kind of close to finishing this character. We've got this one rigged. It's got the bend there. We've got this rigged. We've got the eyes rigged. Alright, so what are we going to do next? Now we're getting close to being ready to just finish the final touches. We need to put some squash and stretch and some twists and maybe some bends in here. So what I'm going to do is I'm just going to grab my local control and I'm going to select create deformers nonlinear, and let's start off with squash. So I have selected the local control. That means everything under that, everything parented under that, is going to squash and stretch, which is quite nice. But the problem is, like I said, I don't want it to squash and stretch from the center here. I want it to squash and stretch from the bottom. So I'm going to turn my low bound to 0, and I'm going to move this down, and I want to center it right in the middle. I can actually use the top view. Alright, and high bound I'll do 2. And see, it squashes and stretches from the base now. Actually, I want the to be 1.5, right over the feather. Yeah, that's better. Alright, so we got our squash. Now we're going to connect these to this, so we're going to put a new attribute in there. But let's just put all of the handles in there first. So now we've got the squash and stretch. So again, I'm going to grab local, and let's do twist. And twist, if you remember, I don't need like the high bound and low bound. I would actually say, again, I want this to be in the center. Because I have the eye control, it's not really in the center. And I can say low bound will be minus 0.8. Let's see. Oh, no, minus 0.9. Okay, that's good. And the high bound will be 0.8. Maybe 0.75. Just above this part. So let's test it out. Start angle. Alright, that's good. And then here's the other angle, so this gives it a little bit of twist. Alright, so we've got some nice twisting going on. Alright, so that's good. So again, local control, and now I'm going to call this bend forward. Okay. And again, I want this in the center. And I will, okay, that's left and right. So I'm just going to curve this over, and I'm going to rotate it 90 degrees on my y-axis. So now it bends forward. But again, I want to bend it from the base. So I'm going to give it a low bound of 0 and a high bound of 1.5, and I'm going to bring it down like so. So now it bends forward and backwards. Alright, let's bring it back to 0. Good. Now I want one more bend, left, right. Create a corner, bend. I'm going to rename this. Left, right, LR. Alright. And I know that I want my low bound to be 0, high bound to be 1.5. I need this to be in the center. Okay. And let's look at the, oops, it needs to be down also. So now this guy can bend, oops, he can bend left and right also with a nice like bend. So I've got all of these handles connected, and that's great. This looking great. So I'm going to grab them, I'm going to group them, and I'm going to call this extra CTL, extra controls, alright? And I'm going to put them in my local control here. And the truth is, I actually don't want to see them because I'm going to animate them with a control. So you see here, now I have a very clean rig. I have these guys, I have this one, I have this one, and I have this one. But how do I animate the squash, the stretch, and all of this? I'm going to go here, and I'm going to add an attribute. And I'm going to say squash. Alright. And then I'm going to add, and then I'm going to twist up, because we're going to do it to the upper twist, and then we're going to do twist down, and then we're going to bend forward, add, and then bend left, right. Okay, so I've got twist up, squash, twist up, twist down, bend forward, bend left, right. And of course, what do I need to do? I need to connect those attributes again. So again, I'm going to go to my connection editor, and that's on the left, and those are going to be twist, squash. Let's start with squash. So the squash handle here, we need to grab the squash here, reload right, and it's factor that I'm connecting to. So factor. Alright, it's always good to just test it real quick. So you see this? I'm using my head control here, and it squashes here, and I don't need to go into my extra controls. Alright, so squash is done, twist is next, reload left, oops, right here, reload right, and up is start angle, down is end angle. So let's try this out. Twist up, alright, it starts from down, good. Next, bend forward, bend 2, okay, there we go. Having a hard time. So bend forward should be curvature for the bend 2, which is my forward. And now bend 3, load it up, and left right, curvature, close, and let's see. Bend forward works, left right works, twist down works, twist up works, squash. So we have now added all of these connections. Now what was important is that I added all of the controls first And then, only then, for my local control with these extra controls that affect everything, do I put on the squash twist. Because if you don't do that, then when you add later, sometimes it will break the rig. And that's why we have the order of operations. We need to model, we need to UV, texture it, then we want to add in all the other controls, and finally we add in the overall body controls. And a lot of this we learned through trial and error. Like, it took me a while to get this right, but once you figure it out and you do it a couple times, it becomes pretty easy.